Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Nimoy Studio. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum. Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's program, Reimagining Myths for Our World, with Matthew Aucoin and Peter Sellars. Tonight's program is co-presented with our wonderful colleagues at the LA Opera, and I want to especially thank Stacy Brightman for her enthusiasm and collaboration, and the LA Opera's president and CEO, the visionary Christopher Kelsch, and executive vice president John Knuckles. All of them I'm very grateful to as an opera lover for supporting and creating opera in old and new forms daily, and thank you. And they're all here tonight, so please give them a round of applause. I think the behind-the-scenes people who do the most don't get the acknowledgement, but I'm so grateful to all three of you. I love the LA Opera. Season ticket holder, you should all buy tickets. This talk is part of the Eurydice Found Festival of performances, conversations, and happenings all over LA County, organized by the LA Opera in anticipation of the important new opera they commissioned called Eurydice. Eurydice was created by composer Matthew Aucoin and librettist Sarah Ruhl, based on the play by Sarah Ruhl, which takes the Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice as a starting point and makes Eurydice the central character. The new opera just had its world premiere in the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion last Saturday night to great acclaim. I hope you all have your tickets already. I'm going this Saturday night, and I'm super excited. You have all received a copy of the Eurydice Found Festival Guide on your way in, so you can also see that there are literally hundreds of exciting related programs going on all over LA. We've had several here at the Hammer Museum. We had a Samuel Beckett play, a screening of the classic film Black Orpheus, and an evening with artist Candace Williams, who has her own ongoing Eurydice project. And tonight's conversation is the final Hammer program. Composer Matthew Aucoin is one of the most exciting new faces in classical music, and as an opera fan, I was thrilled when the LA Opera selected him as their first ever artist in residence. He's been here in LA for 3 years, conducting and composing, all culminating in the thrilling debut on Saturday of his newest opera, Eurydice. And from LA, it will travel to the Metropolitan Opera in New York. I was lucky enough to see Matthew Aucoin conduct the Philip Glass opera Akhenaten in 2016, and it was absolutely glorious. I will remember that production forever, and if you were there, you definitely will too. So the first thing you'll notice about Aucoin when he gets up here is that he's very young, as in under 30. And in that short life, he's been incredibly prolific as a composer of opera and of instrumental music, and as a conductor and as a writer. And if that isn't enough, he's also a concert pianist who's performed all over the world and also accompanied some of the most famous opera stars in recital. He received the MacArthur Genius Award in 2018, and in addition to his artist residency here at the LA Opera, he's also the co-artistic director of the American Modern Opera Company. Aucoin's 2 previous operas, Crossing, about Walt Whitman, and Second Nature, a dystopian fairy tale of Earth 100 years from now, have been performed all over North America, including productions at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, the Lyric Opera of Chicago, and the Canadian Opera Company. At LA Opera, Aucoin has conducted productions of his own opera, Crossing, Verdi's Rigoletto, and as I mentioned, Akhenaten. He's also appeared as a guest conductor with the Santa Fe Opera for Peter Sellars' new production of John Adams's Dr. Atomic. He was also guest conductor at the San Diego Symphony, the LA Chamber Orchestra, and the Rome Opera Orchestra, among others. He trained as a conducting apprentice at the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and served as an assistant conductor at the Met Opera. Aucoin's orchestral and chamber music has been commissioned and performed by such artists as Yo-Yo Ma, Zurich's Tonhalle Orchestra, Salzburg Mozarteum Orchestra, the Brentano Quartet, the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra, and Chanticleer. And he's also been in rock bands and jazz bands, etc. So as you will see, he's very well-rounded. Matthew's joined in conversation by the opera, theater, and festival director Peter Sellars, who is famous worldwide for his groundbreaking and transformative interpretations of artistic masterpieces, as well as for his collaborative projects engaging and illuminating contemporary social and political issues with an extraordinary range of creative artists. Known for exploring challenging moral issues such as race, war, poverty, and the international refugee crisis through his work, Sellars is also a beloved professor here at UCLA in the Department of World Arts and Cultures and Dance. He's the founding director of the Boethius Institute at UCLA, which invites scholars, activists, and artists to work together on projects of public significance, exploring radical ways to rethink relationships of communities and complex issues using the arts as a point of entry. And he's co-curator with the Hammer Museum's Allegra Pacenti of a groundbreaking new exhibition called Inside the Mask, which will open here at the Hammer on February 15th. So tonight we will eavesdrop on Matthew Aucoin and Peter Sellars having a conversation about the ongoing relevance of myths in our world. What do these ancient stories reveal about our psyches? And why do artists in so many fields continue to find themselves drawn to mythological source material? Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Matthew Aucoin and Peter Sellars.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. It's nice to see real friends here and a real friend here. I think Matt and I have studiously refused to prepare for this because what's always nice about having a conversation is to have a real conversation and not have a conversation you just had 5 minutes ago. So just to say, I'll just put down so we can get rid of the subject that was just announced, at least from my point of view. Bill Viola, an artist I collaborated with quite a lot, had a beautiful description of what myth was or is. Bill said, myth is the form you fill out at the DMV. Go ahead and write your name. Write your address and fill the whole thing out because it's about you. That's myth.
Yeah, they're wide open. I'm reminded of something my most important teacher, Jory Graham, said. My most important teacher is a poet, not a composer, and she was here at the Hammer, I think, all of 10 days ago. It looks like some people were here. And someone pointed out that in Jory's work, it almost seemed like she thought the myths had actually happened. And she said, it's not that I thought they happened, it's that they are happening all the time inside of all of us. Which is a definition that I love because the reason that these stories formed, we don't know how long ago, is that they didn't happen. They are processes in the psyche that tell us something about ourselves that we can't learn any other way. And also, you can find them at the DMV.
So for me, this week is particularly an amazing week, and I just don't want to let it slip by. This amazing person has made a giant opera.
It's giant, for better or worse.
Giant.
Yeah.
And it's the first time working at this huge scale and at one of these giant machines. And you not only pulled it off, but you actually made a new step in the history of these things. And I just, yeah. So I would just love to just get your fresh, what are you feeling right now from where you are? Because you've climbed a mountain, you're at the top of it, and now you can see the other side, maybe.
Well, I mean, total relief and joy. But what's funny about working on this scale is that I felt that I had to resist the scale in order to make a piece that I actually wanted to compose. This piece is co-commissioned between LA Opera and the Met, and the Met is sort of a famously grand canvas. You know, the composer John Harbison, who had trouble writing for the Met, was asked what actually would work there, and he said, I don't know, King Kong. And I did not want to make King Kong. Like, I really desperately did not want to do something that was elephantine by design. So I really wanted to go inside and write the most intimate piece that I possibly could with these extraordinary resources. What I really mean is the human effort that goes into the community effort that goes into bringing an opera to life, because it is so much more. What you see on the stage is just the tip of the iceberg. The tech, the musical, the dance, the visual elements. And I decided I really wanted to tell a story that is the deepest possible dive into an individual's psychology. And I had this obsession with the Orpheus story. And for the first couple of years of writing the opera, I thought I was writing an Orpheus opera, but it turns out I'm actually not. I was writing a piece based on an entirely different story that Sarah Ruhl dreamed up. And this is something I want to get into, is that myths can spawn other myths. And I think Sarah probably thought she was writing an inversion of the Orpheus story when she started her play. But because the figure of Eurydice is basically a cipher in so many previous operas and previous tellings of the myth, it gave her total freedom to dream up someone new and pour all of her life force into that. So that was the starting point.
And so let's just get intimate. Let's just talk about, how do you create intimacy in a room that seats 3,200 people?
First of all, you trust that the human voice can be most powerful when it's projecting a very soft dynamic, a pianissimo. That the most magical moment in an opera house is when a singer has the control to reach the last row with a soft sound. I think it's one of the miracles. Any of us could actually be heard in the balconies if we just howled, but the capacity to project intimacy is the greatest gift for these extraordinary athletes of the human voice that we have the privilege to work with. So I think that's kind of a key, is that the intimate moments in a big opera house are always the most miraculous because they're so improbable. And that, for me, stands for something about the whole art form. And also, you accept that the orchestra, and in fact the whole space, is an inner space. It's not a circus. It's not a space for exhibition. It is a physical manifestation of an interiority. And once you realize that you're actually hopefully showing the audience something about what it's like to be inside of a psyche at all, because you have this global view of it. So that's always how I've approached literally the space, both the musical space that an orchestra opens up and the theatrical space that we inhabit. I think of it as one kind of mind. And over the course of an evening at the opera, sometimes you're literally in one person's mind, and sometimes you're in a collective psyche of many interiorities. And so it becomes this play. But think of it as this big. You always quote that the Greek amphitheater was an ear. It's also kind of a skull. It's also that's kind of grim sounding, I know. But you're in a very large head, a very large mind in an opera house.
Would you talk about what you do with an orchestra that, again, most people associate with a large volume, and what creates intimacy in an orchestra? And why do you want 100 people to go to an inner place? And how do you get that to happen?
I was having a conversation with a fellow composer recently about why certain composers from a couple of centuries ago do not create balance problems with singers, even though the ensembles were very large. And I realized something painfully obvious, which is that string instruments, because of the nature of strings, as in like string theory, more does not mean louder. More string instruments does not mean a louder sound. It just means a subtler richer sound. The way that a texture that's made of strings does not become harsher or louder. It becomes actually softer and lusher. It's not a perfect analogy, but that's the way that string instruments behave when they're masked. And in the kind of orchestra I'm working with, there are many, many string instruments. There are many, many percussion instruments in Eurydice. There's like a whole kind of percussion city on that takes up about 40% of the pit. And then there are wind, brass instruments, pianos and harps also, which are kind of hybrids. And they all have wildly different personalities. The trick is to think of them as conflicting impulses, again, within a psyche, within a mind, that there can be a kind of electrical impulse, like a thought that you wished you didn't have, but you did have it. And then another part of the psyche kind of reaches over, a trombone inserts itself and says, absolutely not. And then, there's a rustling in the percussion, and then this whole body of the strings can speak with a collective voice that the others don't have. So again, I keep coming back to this idea that it all is interiority, but for me that's very interesting when you think of an orchestra as one kind of psyche, because it has so much internal difference that if you use these wildly different elements not to pile on top of each other and create something gargantuan, but rather to play off of each other and react, then you're really cooking.
And the heart of the piece is a woman learning from scratch who she is.
Yes. We follow Eurydice into the underworld, which almost no telling of the Orpheus story does. It's it's like that Chekhov story where you follow the body after it's pushed off the boat, and you see its journey into the depths of the ocean. We follow Eurydice, who has been lured to the penthouse apartment of the Lord of the Underworld, and she falls down thousands and millions of steps into the underworld and arrives there in an elevator that rains on her, and the rain in the elevator is the river of forgetfulness, and when she is rained on, she loses everything, and she steps out of the elevator and is a total blank slate. And she encounters her father, who had passed away. Sarah wrote the play soon after her own father had died. And so at the moment when most operas are, heating up and complicating something that's been set in motion, this piece kind of unusually starts all over and obliterates all the personality of the protagonist. And we change our course and begin with her to learn everything about who she is. And it's incredibly intimate. The father has to teach Eurydice how to read, has to teach her about her family. At one point, he's refusing to tell her about her family because he knows the grief that it's going to cause her just to hear the names of who her mother was, and she has to insist. And the middle act of the opera is this slow process of her remembering who she is and finally remembering what it was like to be in love. And I think the moment that we really know that she's herself again is when she's able to remember the good and the bad about being in love.
So what's the sound of finding out who you are?
Well, the sound of oblivion is pretty scary. That act begins with sounds that have almost no tone. Percussionists playing sandpaper blocks rubbed together, and glockenspiel played at the very high end of the register, and strings doing this kind of, the dogs in the audience were not happy to hear this sound, let's say. So we begin from sort of almost no tone, and then we get this figure that repeats, this rhythm repeats, even though the harmonies change, for about 9 or 10 minutes, as she enters the underworld and tries to remember and can't. And then it becomes much warmer, I think, over the course of the act. The percussion is used in a very watery way. The instruments are bowed. They're treated much more kind of atmospherically than percussion sometimes is. So we exist in this kind of watery cave space within which the memories return. I have this clear sense that we're in a cave, and there's a dampness, and it doesn't feel like home. But then by the end, I think some heat returns to it. That what's missing at the beginning is heat.
And how does the orchestra bring heat into the picture, or is it through the voice?
It's a good question. I think the orchestra becomes more unified. You know, they start to speak more as one voice. At the beginning, it's a skeletal orchestra. You know, it's literally just the skeleton of the sound. And by the end, it's flesh and bones. And you know, I think you can choose as a composer. Do you want the atoms to become molecules? Do you want this instrument and that instrument to become a macro instrument, or do you want to keep them separate? And that's the difference. Is that by the end, I think it's cohering.
And how long is the sequence?
That act's about 45 minutes.
So what, did you start with that in your mind, or did you just get there?
It was the hardest part by far.
Because that's what I'm thinking. I mean, that's a huge thing to undertake, and also, again, everybody goes on about your youth, which I'm not impressed by. But just to say,
neither.
Still, as a young person, to decide to do this, I'm starting from blank and have to find the thread of my entire life again. What drove that? I mean, you said Sarah lost her dad and was dealing with that, of who she was once he was gone. Mm-hmm. Why would you, at this moment, writing this piece that is such a huge moment in your life, why would you say, I'm going to devote it to that?
It may have just been sheer recklessness. You know, there's moments where I couldn't
recklessness
believe...
is the very topic. Yeah. Nobody writes an opera that's the same title as the first opera ever written. I mean, that's just that's not hubris is somewhere way back there. We're in another zone entirely. So yes, that's obnoxious. But I want to get to what's inside. That's not, I'm going to show the whole fucking opera world what I can do. There's a deeper thing that's going on that takes you there and makes you use this whole opportunity to work at places like the Met to go into that cave.
You know, I realized just recently that I started sketching the piece the week that I met my now fiance.
Oh, wow. And
I actually didn't think that was the case. I'd forgotten. But Sarah pointed this out, too, that Sarah is a bit older than me, but she was the same age that I was when she wrote the play as I was when I started writing the opera. And she was also very much in love. And she said to me a couple of times, I think you have to be at exactly that life stage to write about a love affair from this perspective. And I think if I'd known how intense it was going to get, the process, I mean, I might not have had the courage to start, but that's the great thing about starting a piece. You can only see 2 feet in front of you. Otherwise, no one would ever write operas. You know, if you actually knew how much you're going to suffer over the course of it, you would never take the first step. But the piece begins so innocently. You know, it's like the same way that, without making any comparison in the quality of the piece. The reason that the love duet in Otello has to be there is that we have to see this one shining image of love, and then by Act 2, it has to be gone forever. Sarah begins the play with this beautiful 10-minute scene of young love, and then we obliterate it completely. But I did start there, and I was in love, and that's really why.
And you are in love.
And I also am in love, yes.
Can I just... I just want to go back to the cave for a second. I'm sorry. It's just... No, but for me, that's, again, the reason you do opera and not a play is music is actually... I mean, the fact is none of us are alone in the world, and all of us are part of all of these molecules and atoms that are interacting. And opera lets you know you're not alone, because every time you're thinking or saying something, there are 200 people doing it with you. And it really creates this dense fabric of being and this incredible network, not just of neurons, but the entire universe is part of your experience, and your experience is changing the entire universe. And for me, that's the only reason to do opera, is to just get to the interconnectedness, the World Wide Web way before the internet, that is the actual way in which we communicate, the actual way we sense each other, the actual way you feel you have to call someone right now because you need to talk to them and they need to hear from you. And you don't know why you think that, but it turns out you were right. And just so many of those things in life that are not quote unquote normal behavior, which is why opera is basically by definition abnormal behavior, because human life is by definition abnormal behavior, excuse me. And opera is the only place we can deal with our non-normative beings and realize that none of us are normal, and that normal is the delusion, and inexplicable is the reality. And that inexplicability is so dense with event and with the participation of people you've met and people you haven't met, who are nonetheless creating the reality that you're experiencing, which is what I love about the form, is just that every moment is so charged with stuff that you can't even imagine. And so for me, again, the thing I particularly am drawn to is you making this, with all the lushness, but you making this just the heart of the piece be 4 to 5 minutes of the recovering of a human being, finding quote unquote who they are, but also meeting the parent that you couldn't talk to and having the conversation you could never have, which again is for me not theater. Opera has to create that weird space where you contact your ancestors, where your ancestors are present, and where the dream space that makes that possible also has healing energy.
It's mysterious, that healing energy, because I think my favorite operas are also the most merciless about human relationships. They don't ever say that everything's going to be okay. And at the one time that Mozart says, we're all happy now, he writes the saddest music in the history of the human race. At the end of Figaro, when people say we're about to be happy, it's like the saddest thing you've ever heard. And yet there is this healing just by laying bare the nature of the relationships. That's...
Well, can we call it honesty?
Yeah.
Like a little honesty actually is healing. It's painful, but excuse me, you're not going to heal until you face certain things. And so one of the things opera does is create this zone where you can face impossible things that you've been avoiding in spoken theater of your life, but that the orchestra part of your life has never stopped listening to.
I could tell from early on that Sarah's play was kind of a closet libretto, because of just the musicality of first of all, her stage directions and the unbelievable pressure that she puts on the things people say because of how much they cannot say behind those things. When you have a whole act where your protagonist has lost all sense of who she is and is essentially unable to communicate, that opens a door for music, for me anyway. And the stage directions are just beyond beautiful. In the underworld, the father builds a room out of string for Eurydice. This can take time. It takes time to build a room out of string, which is, for me, like the most obvious invitation for an interlude. And so now we have 5 minutes of a room being built out of string in music. It can be done in theater. It is a play after all, but for me, opera magnifies those moments, whereas in theater, they're sort of obstacles. they're things that you have to work around, whereas we can focus on it, and I love that.
So, yes, part of the opera is, again, announcing you're doing opera about the same subject as the oldest opera officially ever written, has a, I'm looking backward thing. But would you talk about the part of the opera that's only looking forward?
There was one moment where Sarah and I were talking with an audience, and someone asked, how are you empowering Eurydice? With the assumption that we were. And it was interesting for me because I thought, well, every tragedy ever is a story of human disempowerment. And the point of this piece is certainly not to say, you go girl, Eurydice has, now Eurydice is the greatest musician ever. We're not doing some kind of easy reversal like that. We're actually transferring the tragedy, the guilt, the complexity, everything to this figure of Eurydice, which is morally really complicated. It's every bit as much a story of loss as the original myth is, but it is an entirely different story. So, in a way, I think what Sarah did and what I hope we've done together now is to make the story more complicated. And it's not like it's uncomplicated originally, but to erase all easy interpretations, erase the boundaries, allow both of these figures a deep kind of subjectivity, and show a form of love and a form of life that I think is recognizably America in the 21st century, and then be pitiless enough to show it all disappear, show it all get washed away by the end.
So where does the grieving come from, and where is the grieving going? That is to say, the myth. We've said that word again. Orpheus is torn to shreds by the Furies, and that's always the last move, is what does it mean for this person who was bringing music into the world to be atomized, shredded out of existence, and become part of the atmosphere?
Well, it was tempting to have the Maenads tear him apart in our opera, but you can bring your kids. There's no gore, but there is. I hate to give this away, but it's really important for talking about it. We do see Orpheus at the end, descending in the elevator too, and we had a really interesting moment. Well, so everyone ends up dipped in the river again. It's like the end of a Shakespeare play where the body count by the end is high, because dipping yourself in the river of forgetfulness is the dead person equivalent of committing suicide. It's this longing for total oblivion. And we see it happen to Eurydice's father. We see it happen to Eurydice, and we also see it happen to Orpheus. And there was a moment where our director, Mary Zimmerman, wanted to make it fairly explicit that Orpheus had just killed himself in the world above. And so, finding some way to make that really clear in the staging. And Sarah, interestingly, said, I don't care about that. That's not the point. The point is that someday, maybe 70 years later, maybe 1,000 years later, who knows, Orpheus is a different kind of being, he does come down and does forget. So there is this totality of the loss, but it's not the easier thing of, and then 10 minutes later he kills himself in the world above. So I think, unfortunately, all this grieving is going in the direction of a kind of blank state. But the thing about an evening of opera is that you are so deeply aware of what has disappeared. You're so deeply aware of the richness that I hope it feels like a really natural movement. And I'm answering your question backwards, but where did the grieving come from? In a way, the grieving, I think, is what inspired the play in the very first place. I don't want to speak for Sarah, but she has said similar things herself, that the play is to have more conversations with a person you can't have conversations with anymore. And so the play, the opera, is to engage with that and make it into something other than grief. But because Sarah is an emotionally honest playwright, we do return there.
And so now, just the piece premiered 3 days ago. How do you feel about the piece?
Like, it's not really mine at this point. It belongs to everybody who is bringing it to life in this extraordinary way. It has its own laws. It has its own contradictory laws. Sarah originally put tragedy so close, so infinitesimally close to the wildest sense of humor, and this feeling that we're in the world of Alice in Wonderland sometimes. And she has said that it's sort of, if people are laughing, they're actually more ready than to cry. You're kind of opening them up. It's a feint in a way, that's a manipulative way of saying it. But I think that the piece has an unusually wide range of human experience in it, and those extremes are put next to each other with unusual proximity, and that makes it really emotionally draining. But I think, to me at least, it feels like one world, which is a relief.
And you say it belongs to everyone, but it really does belong to you. You take it home with you at night.
Well, hopefully you'll all be able to take it home with you when you go to the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion this coming Saturday. Yes. No, but I guess I take it home with me in the sense that it has changed me. In the past, I've written my own texts, and what a joy to engage with somebody else's text. I am not a super somber type of person or even type of musician, but I found that when I only write my own texts, I go to this really dark place, and I stay there, and I live there. And it's been really great. It's opened up new facets of my personality to engage with someone else's sensibility.
And so it is. For people who know you or are now going to get to know you. But also for you, how does it feel like a record of this time in your life?
Well, the part about, descending into the underworld and losing everything hasn't happened to me quite yet, but, maybe that's your 30s, I don't know. I think it corresponds to a number of things. I founded an ensemble a couple of years ago called Amok, the American Modern Opera Company. And I love working in this classical music world, but there are lots of traditions, rules, patterns that are not always easy for someone who wants to make new work. And so it's been really important for me to have a community, and I couldn't recommend this highly enough if there are fellow artists out there, especially young ones, that you have to build a space where you feel really free with other people of your generation and other people who are trying to break down boundaries. And for me, Amok has really provided that space. And it's interesting to notice the effect that it has on the work that I do even elsewhere. A certain emotional vulnerability of saying, even though I feel 100% naked as a result of writing this, I have to write it. You need real support to be able to go there. And the building of that community has been really essential. But also, Barack Obama was president when I started writing this piece. The world has gone through multiple revolutions, a lot of them really scary. And I know that my own anxiety level and sense of what the world outside was changed in a deep way. Probably, I know you saw it coming for decades, Peter, but the less clairvoyant among us felt, if this was an earthquake, it was the big one. And total honesty and total emotional vulnerability felt really important. All the kind of the masks, the irony. We composers are prone to it. At times, Twitter hasn't helped. There's so much sort of posturing, and it is so not helpful. It's so not what we need in a climate of extreme disinformation. We have to, if anyone's going to be straight shooters, I feel like it has to be artists. So that wasn't a conscious thing. It's, I don't think artists work like that. Donald Trump is president, so I'm going to be emotionally honest. But it drives you, I think, deeper into that place.
Well, you're in love, so you're going to be emotionally honest. I think we're allowed to say that. All right? And could I just then say, okay, where does your generation want to take opera? Where do you want to take opera? You and the generation of people that you're working with. The art form belongs to you now in some way. What is that going to mean? Where is that going? Where do you, you filled the official spaces of opera now by doing the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion and the Metropolitan. What do you really imagine as an operatic future that interests you and that you're actually going to create?
I think of us, by which I mean a lot of people working in classical music, experimental music, music outside of the pop machine, kind of as the cockroaches that will survive the nuclear holocaust. We are running around totally under the radar of this frightening, gigantic culture that is just, devouring everything in its path. There's something for me very primal about making music with your body in a way that, whether or not it's amplified, doesn't need to be amplified to speak. And that's something that opera singers have in common with classical musicians of all kinds, people working in ancient folk traditions from all over the world. There's this primal, visceral way of making music. We don't think of opera often as visceral or primal. We think of it as over-refined. But for me, the thing that always attracted me to it was that visceral origin of it. And I think that we're going to go back there. I think that the age of really massive scale opera as central may have passed, and the art form is going to invade different spaces, take smaller, lighter forms. Hopefully it will collide with other art forms in different ways. You know, one thing with Amok that has been so fruitful has been engaging head-on with dance. You know, I've watched my colleagues make, 70-minute pieces that are just for a violin and a dancer that feel more like a great opera than, any production of Samson and Delilah you've ever seen. So I think it's, in a way, when things come crashing down, you return to the basics and you trust them. And I think that the basics for this art form are incredibly strong and incredibly tenacious, because all you need is a human body and a soul and the will to master this unbelievably challenging task.
And what is going to be the subject matter?
If anyone has any ideas, I just premiered an opera, and I am thinking I would love to decide what the next one is. I myself am drawn to myth in the biggest sense as a starting point because of its openness, because it's possible to say, certain pieces are feel bound to a period, but you can't really say that about myths, because they need to they need to wear new clothing with every generation. So I could imagine engaging with this source material. We were just talking about how the Norse myths that Wagner used for one purpose can, in another, seen through another lens, look like the climate catastrophe. Ragnarok is basically that, and the things that lead to that are endlessly relevant. And then Sarah Ruhl and I have been talking. We're tempted to do something inspired by King Lear. We're also tempted to do the Vibrator play, which is Sarah's brilliant play about the invention of the vibrator in 19th century America, which totally looks at American repression and the patriarchy and the dawn of electricity, by the way, and what electric light is.
God, yes, thank you.
Through the lens of this machine, used, of course, to treat hysteria. So I see it going in a bajillion directions. And I mean, I want to ask you as well, Peter, about you've both created and engaged with pieces that have the spectrum of subject matter is incredibly wide. But I was thinking about how you treat things that are not obviously myths as myths sometimes. That, the atomic bomb, you saw, well, this is kind of the big looming myth of the American 20th century. And I think you had the courage to view the Bible as a myth rather than as, someone who treats it only as a holy text would not have had the courage to say, there are people like Mary Magdalene and Mary and Joseph in contemporary Los Angeles, but if you let it be a myth, you can do that. I mean, what subject matter is inspiring you these days?
Oh my God! Look, Matt. First of all, name one thing that's not a myth, including what you had for breakfast this morning. I mean, it's all a myth, and what you make of it is what you make of a myth. How you read meaning into anything in your life how you recognize that anything's actually connected to something larger than itself. You're in a cycle of mythology, and you're in a cycle where something has many lives, multiple lives, comes back. You know, everything you went through in third grade, you go through in junior high school, and then you go through in high school, and then you go through in college, and you begin to notice there are cycles in your life. And you're actually not experiencing things for the first time in any way. In any way. And that everything you're experiencing is actually connected in ways that the world is not showing you. But the connections are real. And when I first came to LA, we were working on the Los Angeles Festival, and we made a series called Sacred Spaces. And in the festival, we opened up a lot of the places in Los Angeles that you drive by, but how many people have been inside the Armenian Orthodox Church? Or Second Avenue Baptist in South Central, where Martin Luther King always came to preach here in LA. And one of our ideas was to open these spaces in the city that are sacred and put music there, but put the music you're not expecting. So Wilshire Boulevard Temple had a Palestinian dance troupe and gospel music, and Second Baptist had flamenco and Arab music, and so on. And we were, the Armenian Baptist Church had punk, psychedelic Chicano music. And it was just this idea of opening in every way these sacred spaces. And actually, we had an artists group that curated the festival. There was a 24-person artist group of artists from across the city. And one of the people on this group is an amazing activist, Navajo activist named Paul Apodaca. And he just challenged the idea, how can you make a program called Sacred Spaces? He said, name one space that is not sacred. Everything is sacred. And when you realize that everything you're touching, is nothing sacred, no, everything is sacred. And so beginning with that, for me, anywhere you go is myth. Anywhere you go is sacred. Anywhere you go has all of these dimensions to it. And you touch it, and Jesus is there. You touch it, and Buddha is there. You touch it, ancestors are there. You touch it, your unborn children are there. You touch it, and all of history is moving through your fingertips. And the future just began. So for me, opera is the art form that is capable of recognizing that the three times, as the Buddhists say, the past, present, and future, are all occurring simultaneously. And opera takes every moment into its proper infinity and into its proper sacredness. That you touch something and a chorus is singing. That's incredible and real. Totally real. Like hundreds of voices are in a moment where you think you're alone. So for me, that dynamic of the art form is actually about the nature of reality, not about the nature of fantasy, and is actually about the stakes for making the right decision in your life and making the right gesture and the right action. Is the right action is not about you, it's about all these voices around you, all these voices that are moving through you, this incredible web of connectedness and response, and that responds with some kind of pleasure or some kind of grief.
I mean, I'm curious, when you engage with a subject that some might not see as mythical already, and you're going to invest it with that kind of energy, whether it's Nixon and Kissinger and Mao and Chu Enlai, or the Klinghoffer story or the juxtapositions in El Nino. What do you look for in the people who are going to be building it with you? What are the things that you think, oh, this person can activate it with me?
Well, you're just, you've written now only 3 operas, and you're still, wondering what your 30s are going to be like. Just to say, I got connected early on to a couple of people who I worked with for many, many, many years, and so we built a body of work together, and so it has a certain arc and and it has to do with what's moving through our lives, but it's also a real dialogue, and it's also a marriage. And so, Susan McClary was very clear, with me about John Adams. She said, "Peter, it's a marriage." and actually, I believe in marriage. There's something really beautiful of not living your life alone and not just thinking that the world is your point of view, and what it really means to have to test everything through the eyes and the feelings of another person. And so, to me, opera already by definition is that, is that nothing is a single point of view. And as Alice Goodman wrote so beautifully when we first did Nixon in China, he said there are many Nixons. There's Peter's Nixon, there's John's Nixon, there's my Nixon, there's Jim Madalena's Nixon who sang Nixon. I mean, you're in the presence of, again, everything's in multiple, which is super exciting. And again, why for me opera is able to touch a certain level of reality, which is its multiplicity, that there are just hundreds of simultaneous points of view underway at any given moment. So, just to say, for me, the myth space is the space that we're really living in, and most things that happen to you are happening for a reason. The Quran says very pointedly that your life is a book. Everything that happens to you is a message, and the question is, do you know how to read it? Are you literate? Can you read the book of your own life and get what it's saying to you?
There's a moment in this new opera. It's really poignant, actually. So Sarah taught, and she says was taught by a young poet named Max Ritvo, who, by the time he met Sarah he was an undergraduate and Sarah was teaching at Yale. He had cancer in a serious way, and he passed away of it when he was 25. He got married a year or so before he passed away, and Sarah wrote the vows for his wedding, or wrote something to read in lieu of vows. This beautiful thing in which she says, imagine that you are a book, and imagine that your beloved is a book, and how can a book read another book? It's through love, and imagine that you're a book that's so patient and so wise that it learned to read itself so that it could read the book next to it. Anyway, she took these vows, this poem, verbatim, and put it in the opera as what Eurydice has written for her wedding to Orpheus. And I actually set it to music the same summer that I learned that Max Ritvo passed away. It was pretty much happening simultaneously. So it's sort of this hidden tribute. And it's this funny, yeah. I can sense his energy in there too. You should all read this poet, by the way, Max Ritvo. He managed to publish a couple of collections in his sadly short life, and it's really worth checking out. 4 Reincarnations is a good one.
Questions for this incredible person?
Or this one.
We open it up, yes. Oh, here comes a microphone directly to you.
Is it possible for you to share your next project with us?
I don't know the next opera per se, but I can tell you that with my ensemble Amok, we are creating a new piece with the Philharmonia Baroque Orchestra in San Francisco, which will feature Amok's singers, who are probably very familiar to a Los Angeles audience. They are Julia Bullock, Paul Appleby, Devon Tynes, and Anthony Roth-Costanzo. We are basing this piece on Paul Celan's poetry, the music of Bach, dance, and a whole lot of other things, and that will tour starting next fall.
Thank you.
Yes, hello. Out there. Yes.
Besides what you've said already, what advice do you have to young artists?
Stay young. Don't become middle-aged. Be young. Guess what? You're young. Act it.
I mean, and I'm not in a position to give any kind of advice. The only thing I'm noticing is that all of the work that I've made that has really not satisfied me is so useful, and that it is this long tunnel that you really have to go through, and that your taste is ahead of your ability during those years, and that can be really painful because you sometimes are tempted to look at your own stuff from the outside. But actually, it's a hopeful sign when your taste is ahead of your ability. And it's, no matter how painful it is, it's totally worth it to experience your own bad work, because it's actually getting better every second without you being aware of it.
And meanwhile, just to emphasize that the vehicles for the standard stuff are usually the problem and not the solution. And so when you're rejected by all that, you have a guardian angel. The truth is going to move forward in our society right now, not through the mainstream channels. That's just a fact. And your youth is what you've got, with a whole generation. And, who's better than Greta? Right? Is young people calling it and naming it and not flinching and dealing with the fact that there is nothing to lose, so let's not lose it. And that kind of clarity before you're worried about paying the bills and so on is really, really crucial. And just whatever you need to do for money, please do it, but don't make that your art ever. And meanwhile, make your art about why you're on Earth.
I need to say one more thing. You reminded me of something, Peter, which is that when I was a senior in college, I saw you speak at an event very similar to this. And you said to an audience full of college seniors, you see more clearly right now than you will when you're older. You actually see with maximum clarity right now. And I had a friend who very nearly had a nervous breakdown as a result of this. And she was the kind of person who clearly felt like she was on a path and she was going to achieve maximum success and maximum clarity, at 41, and she was doing everything, to get there. Wow. And you really pulled the rug out from under her, and it was so beautiful because it actually, it's so empowering to think, oh, actually, I do see the world right now. and everyone who's telling me that I don't maybe has an agenda.
Oh,
Please
here
wait
comes
for
the
the mic.
microphone.
It's a question for you. How do you develop your taste?
How do you develop your taste? You taste things. You just keep tasting them, and then you're. Sorry, that's a terrible joke. It's pure experience, you know. I think you have to just be open to the widest range of things, and don't respect genres or boundaries or lines between cultures, and just experience everything. it's I think, you know, everyone with ears and eyes and senses has the potential to discern, I don't want to say good from bad. I want to say, you know, honesty and intensity from dishonesty and, you know, shoddiness of in all kinds of art. It's just about subjecting yourself to experience.
And if I could just add a little bit that we're all drawn very mysteriously to things, that you don't know why you're drawn to it, but you're very moved by it. And there's no explanation for why that kind of music touches you. None. But you feel a pull. Whether it's from a previous lifetime or what, you don't know, but you feel it. And at the same time, in my life, I was just incredibly fortunate to have very beautiful teachers. And I said, I'm going to go this way. And they said, Peter, look over there. I said, yes, but I'm going to go this way. And said, no, Peter, please look over there. And for me, that's one of the most beautiful things, is you encounter people. First of all, you have feelings that you can't explain to yourself. And those are amazing. And then you have people who contradict what you think should be next and redirect your path. I love both of those things as the discovery, process. Oh, please.
The definition of myth that you all have been evoking comes from a very singular, and I hate to, Western tradition, and Greco-Roman Western tradition. And the world of myth, of course, is far more extensive and encompassing than that. And so what happens, or are you willing to entertain that other kinds of enveloping realities that also perhaps are that other direction that Peter Sellars is referring to have the same discoverable, explorable potential as those which you have inherited?
Wow. Yeah, for me, one of the most important things is there's a beautiful book that I told Matt I wanted to bring up tonight called Black Athena, which is a very inspiring book, and it came out 25 years ago, I think, and it really explains philologically that so much of Greek culture came from Africa. And then, of course, a lot more Greek culture came from India. And anytime you say Greek, it's not actually Greek. It's lots of other things. And of course, that's one of the most powerful aspects of myth, is that it moves not through typical geographies and not through obvious localities. And to just say one more thing, again, it's also moves collectively. It moves through these incredible collective movements. And we're not, in our capitalist framework, our big idea is how to get this many toothpastes into the CVS at, over there, and you're, managing Procter and Gamble, and you're organizing the movement of things, and things have to move in the mindset of materialism. And of course, as soon as you put the mindset of materialism away for how anything travels, and how something is moving, and how you travel in the world, but also how the world travels through you, myth opens into these other radical spaces. And I would really just like to say, and I'm going to go see this opera on Saturday night, so I'm dying to see it. But for me, one of the great things about Orpheus is it's just so not a Greek myth in any way, aside from the specific Egyptian Orphic tradition. The Orphic tradition is really intense through Pythagoras. What it means is these reincarnations, these infinite lifespans. The meaning, the myth is actually a vessel for a whole bunch of other stories and a whole bunch of other possibilities. And it's not the story, it's just a vessel that's containing a lot of other things. And I think, Matt, you said earlier that was the pleasure of a myth, is that, it's holding for a lot of content that can move in lots of directions. But I would also really emphasize, Peter, to your point, is it's also a connecting tissue in the planet and across not just civilizations, but lifetimes, and also right now, points of difference. And we're in a very serious moment where the human race has to begin to act together. Climate change is not picking favorites. Suddenly we have to respond as a planet. And something that happens in one part of the planet is happening in another part of the planet. And our usual ideas of separation are being completely destroyed. And we all have to respond not just as subgroups, but we have to find a way to begin to create a concerted response in the next 12 years. And what will the languages be that allow us to communicate across the lines? What will the images be? What will the stories be? What will the shared ability to reach deep into ourselves be? And what will be the way we have insights into people we can't even begin to imagine or talk to? There has to be some possibility for us to move beyond our own limitations and our own isolations. So this field of myth, of course, was invented to gather people for large purposes and to create introspection across an entire community and across eras in human existence. And we need this now in a very serious way. And we need to go way deeper than most of the work on myth that has been done to date, that again is particularized in very inspiring ways, but our new challenge is a really new challenge. And it has to do with where the winds and the currents are coming from, and what's in the wind and what's in the current, and what is it bringing with it. And that's called a tsunami. And those tsunamis are immense and powerful, and the planet itself is speaking. And then we get to the level of myth, which is finally not to be completely anthropocentric, but the part of myth that invites you to, again, understand that we are here as part of a much larger creation and set of relationships, balances, and moral energies that must be acknowledged and lived by. And the myths are also a way of understanding that give us a yardstick outside ourselves by which to measure the way we're living. And we need to step up to that stature of those measurements in the next 12 years, in the next generation, urgently, because the planet is not waiting.
So Matt, you mentioned about the cave and the water and the infinitesimal space between pain and, forget the other, forgetfulness maybe. But I'm wondering, did you and Sarah ever think that you were creating a womb, like the womb and birth, and how we do forget about that, and the pain that maybe we came into the world, your mother birthed you into the world, and then the love of that and the forgetfulness of it, all intertwined within that beautiful music making you were doing?
It did occur to me as I was saying it. It's funny, the cave, I haven't used that image before. It feels like a watery cave. The mother is notably absent in this play, which is not an accident. It is a womb-like space. The forgetfulness is enticing. That's one of the dangers of it, is that it's so nice to live totally separate from reality. And the forgetfulness has its own music too. There are these figures, the stones, who are kind of the guardians of the underworld, whose job is to kind of enforce a lack of emotional expression or engagement or life, really, in any form. And it would be so easy to be like the stones. It would be so easy to give in to that music and live in the womb of forgetfulness and death. And I think that's a big part of the play, is the struggle against that. And this, it's hard to justify the things that are great about life and remembering and others, but you have to enact it. You have to actually experience it and enact it, and I think that's what the opera is trying to do. But you're right. There is this seductive, warm, friendly force of forgetfulness. There were some over on this side, yes.
And then we do have to let people into the night, but let's keep, please.
Hello. Okay. It's very interesting because there's, in terms of sound and theater, we have musicals, and there so many people are divided on that. It's like you love them or you hate them. And then there's opera. What do you see plays moving more towards incorporating sound that are not necessarily musicals? Do you know, where do you see the blending of these three forms in a way?
I cannot speak as an expert on the other two forms. I will say that the difference between what we call musicals and opera used to be much, much smaller. I think there's a deep divide where voices started to be trained differently. Back when all voices had to be trained, I wouldn't have had this microphone. I would have had to be literally speaking in a different tone of voice just to reach even the back row here. It was a whole different way of using your voice. There's a great example of politicians. There's a generational divide between the ones who were trained to speak at rallies without a microphone and the ones who were trained to speak on television. And when you put the first kind of politician on television, that person looks ridiculous because they're basically shouting. They have no idea that you can talk normally because there's a microphone. so there's this deep divide between these ways of making sound, between musicals and opera, and that's deepened and become a real cultural difference too. But I don't actually see any of these. I don't see any of the lines. I think operas can amplify voices. Plays can incorporate music. You can have an opera that's 100% silent if it feels like an opera. It's these are all elements, and they can be blended in every imaginable way. The categories you just mentioned are useful sometimes to let people know generally what they might hear, and it's much harder to make a piece that falls somewhere else, falls between, but it can be just as rewarding.
And just to say, the new technology, lighting has not changed that much from the 19th century. The new technology is sound. And sound is in a state of total transformation. And so even just in theater, I work a lot with an artist named Bruce Odland, who's a sound artist and musician, who, when we're doing Chekhov, Seagull, Bruce went and recorded a lake with microphones across a mile span, and then brought the lake into the theater. And the music of a lake in Chekhov, the music of the waves, the music of the patterns, the music of the insects, all of that stuff was the score. And it was all moving as music. We can do that now. And the technologies are astounding of ways in which sound is now so alive in theater that never could happen before. Theater usually had the crisis of we're inside. And now we have this whole other realms and realms of sound that we're living in with the new technologies. So
maybe we have time for one more.
One more over there, is
here?
that true?
Yes.
Yes.
So the original myth of Orpheus and Eurydice is a tragedy, and then the story of Eurydice is often forgotten. But while in your opera, Eurydice does end up finding herself and is able to have the conversations that she wouldn't have in her former life. I think that's very warming, and there's something very beautiful in that. But I also, especially more so because I know the ending, I think there's something poignant in the fact that she ends up losing all of that again in the end when she's washed by the Lethe. So I was wondering what Eurydice means to you personally, because I don't think it's either a tragedy or just a warming, beautiful story. I feel like it's something in between, and I was wondering what she meant to you personally.
She means a lot to me this week. She's a person. What do any of us mean? What does a person mean? It's almost too big. It's too big of a question for me to answer, because what I love about Sarah's creation, and I've tried to mirror it in the music, is that it's not reducible. I can't say it means to me that it's a tragedy. I can't say that it means that it's a morality tale. I can't say that it, I can't say any one thing. I can say that I now think of Eurydice as a friend. And I think of Eurydice as a three-dimensional human being who has all these flaws that are so frustrating, the way that all of your friends have flaws that drive you crazy, but she is capable of so much boundless love. And I think what we've tried to do is to capture that whole thing in a way that would make you want to befriend her as well.
Wow, Matt.
Peter.
Can we thank Claudia Bester
Thank
and
you,
the
Claudia.
Hammer Museum? Please. Thank you, Claudia, for allowing us to be here. Thank you so much for your beautiful program. Thank you very much.